Let's see.
Hi there, this is
Hey,
S.J. Thomason, and I today am really excited that I'm featuring Nathan Ormond. And Nathan and I met on Twitter, and he is an agnostic, and he's from England, and you'll hear that by his very distinctive and enjoyable accent. And he is willing to come in here and talk about how he became an agnostic after, I think if I understood him correctly, after Doug PineCreek's show. So PineCreek was effective in his street epistemology. And so I've done videos before on street epistemology where I've talked about it. And some have said I don't have a very good interpretation of street epistemology. So hopefully Nathan can clear that up. So Nathan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
yeah, so I'm someone who wasn't raised Christian, but I became a Christian around, it's about 2.5, 3 years ago now. And then I would have identified as Christian for maybe that 1.5 year period. And I was getting into philosophy and apologetics in order to understand the reasons for the faith that I had. And I felt the need to also evangelize to others and stuff like that. Um, and then through that, I guess I got involved a bit in some of the YouTube stuff online. I came across PineCreek Doug's channel. And one day I was talking in the chat, kind of like people were refuting some of my points and I was like pushing back on their points. And so he just invited me in to talk to him. And I think that was the first time, because I'd been going out doing street evangelism and I had many conversations with people about my faith. I was fine. But that was the first time that I was really challenged on what I believed. And it was because of the epistemology, the mechanism by which I came to believe. I started seeing there was some kind of biases that I'd applied to my reasoning. So I think that then made me take a bit of a step back and look at things. And then I started to just kind of, it was like an emotional doubt perhaps at first. And then also I was just looking at, well, yeah, why? Well, where could there be a basis, say, for some of these defeaters to my belief? So I'd read like Alvin Plantinga's Knowledge and Christian Belief on stuff like that. And then I thought, okay, this makes sense as like a philosophical epistemology. But then I've got to say, well, the Mormon and the Muslim, if they've got a properly basic belief in the same sense, they're just as justified as I am. So that's not really satisfactory. And I guess I just, as I dug more and more into these things just kind of stripped away a bit. I started to view certain things as more psychological, to do with the church and why I'd picked up certain beliefs, rather than it being like truth based. And I guess I find myself where I'm at now, where I'm not. I wouldn't assert positively that there's no God that exists. I actually kind of hope that there is, but I don't know is my position.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So you weren't raised a Christian, and then you became a Christian. How did that happen? How did you originally become a Christian just a few years ago?
Yeah, so I guess I'm someone who's always had like really bad depression. I've always thought about things as well. And I think that as I was kind of, what was I, around 20 years old, and you've got life's changing in a load of big ways, a load of responsibility to take on. And I was looking for these deeper questions. And I did have a few experiences on like mushrooms and stuff, which opened me up to a kind of spiritual or religious realm, something like that. I then started exploring religions. I got into some of Jordan Peterson's stuff. I was really a big fan of his message, and then he did his psychological interpretation of the biblical stories. So I went then through all that series, and I thought, well, I'd quite like to read the Bible a bit. So I went along to a local Bible study group at a church, and gradually, I suppose, became a Christian through that process of reading the Bible weekly with people, having I guess just becoming embedded in the church community in that way as well. Like it slowly became the way I was living and thinking about things.
That's interesting. So I like the fact that you listen to a lot of the same people I do. So I love listening to Jordan Peterson. In fact, I just went on a binge this morning listening to several Jordan Peterson videos. I usually tweet them out, but I thought to myself, I don't want to overdo all the Jordan Peterson videos that I've been watching. And then I also have listened to and read, I shouldn't say listened to, but I've also read some Alvin Plantinga. So you mentioned him. So I think he's pretty deep and philosophical, and he's got some pretty good arguments. He does the ontological argument, which actually I would probably say is one of the weaker arguments, for Christianity, but I think that
Okay.
others claim that Plantinga's got a really good version of it. But I think
Yeah,
there
I
are
think
others
so.
some even better arguments. But so you say you'd hope there's a God, but then right
Oh,
now you're kind of up in the air on it. You just don't feel like you know. Is it?
yeah, I don't think I basically don't think there's much what you'd call like epistemic warrant for theological claims, really. Um, and I started to look at then all these differences between different systematic interpretations within Christianity. So like the church I went to was really Calvinist, for example, and I just wasn't kind of getting that from the Bible. But then it's like, well, even within that, it's like I went to a course on Christian ethics at a local seminary, like Nazarene church, and they'd have very different interpretations of hermeneutics and and I was like, well, this isn't really a reliable way of coming to, it's we we're just basically making dogmatic claims about the way the world fundamentally is, but there's no reliable mechanism for actually proving that they're the case from reason alone and first principles, I think.
So some of it has to do with, it sounds like, because there's a lot of different denominations and there's just also there's other religions that you feel like you can't make a decision on Christianity or any one sect in Christianity because there are so many other options. Would that be fair?
That, I mean, sort of that, but it would be looking at then, well, why is it the case that there are these different sects and denominations? And then, well, it's the mechanism by which Christians are coming up with these doctrines is by interpretation of what the Bible says. And there seem to be like these almost equally valid ways of people of reading it and pulling out this systematic doctrine that they then build the church around. And even though these can be in conflict in places, it's like this isn't really a reliable way of forming beliefs about the world.
So if that's really interesting, and actually I also have to agree with you on Calvinism. I think that some of the Calvinist doctrines are kind of, I don't think they take a fair understanding of God's concurrency in the past, present, and future. And I think Calvinists try to lock God into linear time as we are locked into linear time. And I don't think that that looks at it correctly. So I prefer the Molinist perspective that basically says that God knows what you would, could, and will do in certain circumstances. And he tries to place people in optimal circumstances to bring us closer to him. But you won't find that in some churches. You'll find this Calvinist perspective, or like you mentioned Mormons and Muslims and all these different groups. One of the things I wanted to say is, what would you, or if you could imagine yourself being put into ancient history and being around at the time when Jesus had been on the earth, say in the year 33 AD when he was crucified, and then go into the years right after that and say you met Paul and you met others, but they hadn't yet written the New Testament and they hadn't yet written their church documents or anything like that. Do you think that they had enough without the Gospels and without different interpretations and actually even they did have different interpretations. Paul was arguing with Peter and he documented that. So we do have that kind of thing. But is that enough to say, well, let's just say that the Christianity can't be true because different people have different interpretations of it?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I differ from perhaps a lot of atheists and agnostics in that I'd say personal experience for an individual who has it can be a good reason to believe. Because I'm lean towards like a philosophical worldview that's called like subjective idealism, where what I'm saying or a form of like phenomenalism, what we're most sure of is our sense quality, but I'm not a metaphysical solipsist, but I'm saying what I'm sure of is what immediately goes on around me. So someone could be justified in accepting say God beliefs based off of very particular experiences which clearly led to that. The problem is that I don't have those same experiences myself. So like you might have those experiences which warrant your belief. So Paul might have those those experiences of miracles, say, or witnessing Jesus, and therefore that's a pretty good reason for him to believe, or the apostles as well. But I don't have that. I've got unanswered prayers, or maybe experiences during like music being played, but that's the same as being at, say, like a rock concert or something like that, or listening to an Islamic call to prayer, which might create the same sense of reverence for beauty as hymns and things in a church. I've got these experiences, but they don't warrant a particular God belief, I'd say.
That's interesting. So you do see a spiritual side to Christianity, or even to some other faiths. You see the spirituality in that. Is that fair to say?
I'd say I'm not even certain I'm not certain that it's spiritual, because it can be explained by natural phenomena as well. Like, you could explain the reason that I find a hymn beautiful, for example, in terms of the way that the waves superimpose and harmonize with each other, and what that causes in my brain, and the serotonin and dopamine, etc. You could explain it in those terms, but I'd say then this is where the kind of idealism thing comes in, that I fundamentally experience that in my consciousness. So explaining it in terms of those material properties is secondary to that. But I don't know that this mental realm is necessarily like has to be attached to a deity of any form, or has to be attached to any form of like religious belief.
That's interesting. But even if you look at the hymn and you look at the notes on a page, you can't reduce that simply down to its natural components, because if you look at the notes on a page, you realize that a mind had to produce those notes on a page, and it had to give them meaning.
I'm not sure we can always say that's the case. Like, for example, we do see sequences of cause and effect in nature where seemingly random events create what we then interpret as patterns. So one of which, for example, off the top of my head, is in the desert valley, where like stones move across, or like the patterns that wind cuts through rocks. The even like waves, and as the tide goes out to the sea, the kind of patterns that are left. There are all these mathematical patterns throughout the universe, but they're not necessarily caused by an intelligent mind. There can be an impersonal cause behind those things.
Interesting. So have you heard of the Kalam cosmological argument? I noticed you mentioned cause and effect, so it makes me think of causes, and of course also
Sorry, you broke up for me.
An infinite regression.
Sorry, you broke up for me then a second.
What's that?
You just broke up for me a second then.
Oh, I'm sorry. So are you familiar with the Kalam cosmological argument?
I think my internet, yeah.
I just got you back. I think we had a little shake up there, but I think you're back.
Yeah, I think it's my internet's being a bit funky. Hopefully it's stabilized now.
Now I can hear you. And I want to say thank you to everybody in the chat. I see a lot of people in there that are having a lively conversation. So I just want to say thank you. And I am paying attention to that. So if you guys have questions for Nathan and you want to just put it out there, I'll go ahead and ask him some of these questions. But I wanted to ask you, Nathan, are you familiar with the Kalam cosmological argument?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
So if you, do you buy this idea that time, space, and matter had a start date?
I don't know. So everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Again, I'm not sure if that's necessarily analytically true. And then I don't know if I've observed enough empirically to say that this is a universal truth. Everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. It could be the case, but there are these weird things to do with like the quantum realm where these sorts of principles seem to break down. The universe has a cause of it. The universe began to exist. Again, a contentious point. The universe may be eternal. Now, we could argue from time that that's not possible, because how would we get to the present day? Or perhaps the universe has exists necessarily in some form. Perhaps our understanding of time as sequential isn't quite the right way that time works out. So I think it's a valid logical syllogism, but I'm not sure it's sound based off of each of those premises is uncertain for me, at the least.
Okay, well, I just to be fair, just so the viewers understand what this is. So the Big Bang Theory has been widely accepted ever since about 1925, when a Catholic actually created this idea of looking at time, space, and matter, and realizing that the universe is expanding and continually expanding at a very quick rate, much quicker than it even started expanding. So it's expanding exponentially. And so people started tracing that back. And Einstein initially doubted it because he felt like there were theological implications to such a universe. And so he put out this fudge factor, but then he went and visited the Hubble telescope and he realized that there is something going on here. And he accepted the idea of the Big Bang. So it's the Big Bang dates the universe to about 13.8 billion years. So a lot of people would say, well, if time, space, and matter started at that point, and even actually Stephen Hawking said, okay, I'll give you that time as a linear form started at that point. Someone might say, well, what came prior to that? And from a Christian perspective, I would say that that is something that was well explained in the Bible. It said in the beginning. And so I think that's pretty interesting. And I just want to say, I see PineCreek Doug, who converted you to agnosticism, in the chat.
Yeah, I see him there as well. So you said, you know, I'd even disagree on the point, you see, that the Bible says in the beginning, because I think when the beginning is a more appropriate translation based off of Michael Heiser's syntactic argument for that part of Genesis. So this kind of comes back to that point of how can, if we're basing our beliefs off of theology, it seems like we're not necessarily justified in doing so. But then as we come back to those arguments of physics as well, there is contention among cosmologists as to exactly what this is. So I think Roger Penrose, for example, would argue for a succession of something around like 32 possible like Big Bang events, or someone like Max Tegmark might argue for like a multiverse. And then I mean, we could possibly a contingency argument of some sort, or a first cause argument might be stronger than the Kalam in that sense. But again, even if it were the case that we got to the final premise, we're miles away from the Christian God.
You're right. So the Kalam cosmological argument does not it doesn't even seek to prove a Christian God. It just seeks to prove that there is a force that's omnipotent and a causal force and intentional and personal. And so
it might not necessarily be omnipotent, though. It might just be powerful enough to, it might just be powerful enough to cause the universe, or the universe might necessarily exist in some sense. So on that point, I'd say, we don't start positing these kind of attributes of aseity that the Christian God would have, because it's not even necessarily a being that caused them.
So, okay, so we'll go, well, actually there are other arguments, but before we get to that, I wanted to go back to, since I'm looking at the chat and I'm seeing, I was asking people, if you want to ask a question to Nathan, feel free to post it and I'll go ahead and I'll ask him. But for now, I wanted to say, what is it about street epistemology? Are you using that approach now yourself? Are you going out into the streets and talking to people about their views?
No, I don't really plan on doing that. I do think it could be useful in the context of, so there are some people who I've talked to, for example, on, like, even when I was a Christian, my view on Genesis. And, there was a guy I talked to, I tried to take him through like John Walton's book, for example, on Genesis. And, I was just kind of getting shouted at. It says kinds. I don't see one kind turning into another. And I think something like street epistemology could have actually been really good for stopping him from getting as emotionally involved and being able to question those things without it, because going down that kind of path it did, where it felt like more like conflict. And I think talking with more fundamentalist religious types, this isn't just Christianity, this could be Islam, it could be Mormons, it could even be atheists who take a very fundamental stance. I think it could be a good methodology for just avoiding conflict, but getting people to think about their reasoning and justify it.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. I want to say Rachel in reality is asking, she said, what would it take to convince you that Christianity is true?
So I would accept philosophical arguments, scientific evidence, personal experience, any of those things would convince me. And I'd say personal experience obviously wouldn't be good for convincing anyone else, but like if some crazy miracle happened in my life, or I had a vision of something, I'd still question it, but I think that would still make me lean towards Christianity for sure.
Oh, okay. I'm just trying to see if I see James in the chat here, so I want to go ahead and did something. So you'd say, and I think that's really fair to say, the personal experience, because to be honest, I've read all of the arguments. I know the teleological argument and the cosmological argument and ontological. I mean, there's just a ton of arguments. There's also even looking at the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. But the real clincher for me was personal experience. So I feel like that's completely fair, because you feel like, well, shouldn't I get that personal experience before even having to look into all of this evidence?
Yeah. But the problem for me was when I was thinking of personal experience was that for those other denominations, for the Muslim, the Hindu, etc., they also have personal experience. So when I was like going out and saying, look guys, it says here in Romans that everyone's got sufficient knowledge of God, so is without excuse, a la like James White. Well, I was like, hang on, can I really say that when like why my reasoning is leading me is to say actually these are all, it's valid for someone to hold this alternative religious position provided they have an experience.
Yeah, that's fair. And I see DJ Roush is saying even personal experience is interpreted according to our worldview. And I think that's a fair statement. I can say I did for about 20 years after I left the Catholic faith in my 20s because I was upset about the way that the priests were handling things and the Pope wasn't doing enough about what was going on in the church. And so my family, most of my family and I left, and I was waffling around for about 20 years thinking the Eastern religions were superior, especially Buddhism. So I was looking into that. And then I suddenly started having experiences that gave me a lot of light and it's the view of Jesus. Basically, I started having a number of different experiences that were spiritual that pointed me right back to Christianity. And I came back. And so I can say that I do understand that this idea, especially looking in some of these other faiths and saying, well, geez, maybe I'm in the wrong faith. Maybe it's just because I was born in the United States that I'm just following the default. But I can say that I think as a reasonable person, we should go out and try to investigate our beliefs and find out why we do believe those. Because looking back on it now with Hinduism, the idea with Hinduism is that gods were created, the world is recycled essentially, the universe is recycled, and it's a constant process. So that actually goes against some of the scientific findings we have with the Big Bang. And it also has this idea that gods are within or immanent in the universe instead of transcendent to it. And so Christianity says God is transcendent and immanent. And the Muslim faith basically says that Allah is transcendent, but not immanent. He doesn't interact with people in their lives. And it says that in the Quran. So I feel like if you actually follow these different belief systems through their logical conclusions, you would probably come to Christianity in not too long.
So, I mean, I'd possibly disagree on the characterization of Islam and Hinduism there. So like the concept of a Brahman, for example, or the concept of like Purusha, the spirit that the world's laid on, things like this are potentially compatible with these kind of arguments that are being used as theistic proofs, I think. And I'd say if we're following reason again, and we were to come to some kind of maximally great being, it could be Allah. There's no reason for it to be necessarily a Trinitarian God of Christianity, or it could be I think it could be an impersonal God as well. So I'd kind of say it's a bit more in the air as to whether it obviously leads to Christianity in that way. I'm not sure it does.
Okay, so you're not so, and actually, I should give credit to that particular argument that I just used with immanent and transcendent, because I got that from Hugh Ross, and I don't know if you've read any of his stuff, but he's got some
not much.
Pretty good books out there. And I see Rai Rez is asking if I've practiced mindfulness. I did do some of those sorts of things when I was in my moving around belief systems, but and I didn't accept Christianity by a process of elimination. I was just trying to offer that process for Nathan, but that's not how I became a Christian. I became a Christian because Jesus basically started showing me the truth through dreams, visions, and things like that. And so I'll just tell you that's why I became a Christian. And at that point I was, thinking the Buddha God was superior. So it wasn't really a Buddha God, but I was thinking the Eastern faiths were superior because they were just deep and transcendent and that kind of thing. Yeah. And so I thought that was something. But I want to ask you this. So let me just see if since you're in England, how is the mood over there with respect to Christianity? Because it's my understanding that Europe is what they're calling Euro-secularization. So European countries are increasingly becoming more atheistic, and especially the Western and the Northern European countries. Would you say that's pretty fair?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really complicated stuff going on. I'm not sure that secularization is 100% a good thing. I think it's causing a lot of political polarization as people look for identity and philosophical worldviews in things other than religion which was kind of culturally readily there. And so we see like a shift more towards say like identity politics, and that's on both sides, left and right wing. And people, I mean, it's a good thing in some sense. Like I think there is moral progress from like medieval times, for example, or feudalism, for sure. But what does worry me is the kind of polarization we see as a result of it politically. But certainly, yeah, the vast majority of people, I think, are just apathetic to philosophy. Most people want to go about their lives. They're happy with their job that pays comfortably, their family, their house, etc., and aren't really bothered about the big questions of life. Seems to be the mood I get.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is a lot of apathy, and I think that actually, if I had to characterize what I see going on in Europe, is I would say, you know, and I've been reading a lot of. There's a survey called the World Values Survey that's out of the University of Michigan, and it's put on by a person called Ron Engelhardt, and he's been collecting waves of data since the 80s, and he has noticed that there's an increasing trend towards what he calls secularization and rationalism, and away from traditionalism and religion. And I've seen other studies on that. And one of the reasons that people say that there is this trend is because in Europe, there's a lot of social safety nets. So people, basically the government's taking care of the poor people more than the churches. And so people don't have some of the needs that people were using churches for, especially those who are what they call extrinsically religious, which is basically a belief that what can Christianity do for me versus what can I do for Christianity? So it's this intrinsic faith based on the benefits of showing up to church and being in a community. And I think when you believe under that kind of a system, and then you find that the government's taking care of a lot of your needs, a lot of people gravitate away from the churches because they don't have they don't have that need from the churches to give them something.
I think though, again, this, as to the question of the truth of religion, it raises some questions for me again. So there's a lot of people in those kind of Calvinist circles I'd hang around who, if someone was a Christian for those reasons of community and stuff like that, they'd say, well, you're going to burn in hell forever because of that, because you don't have the right propositions in your mind that conform to this specific set of views. Well, that's condemnable. And for me, this is where like I was like, in the name of what I see as morally good, truth and that sort of thing, I want to back away from that way of viewing this political paradigm. I think religion can be incredibly good and useful, but I can also see that it can be very harmful as well when it fosters that sort of attitude, and that can even, you know, like when you see the kind of evangelical support for Trump in the US, that can sometimes be quite harmful. But then you see at the other end, the more liberal Christians polarizing the other way, and that can be harmful in a whole, like Union Seminary and some of the weird sorts of activism that they engage in, I think is harmful just at that other end. And so I think it's not necessarily that it's religion. I think it's just this complicated set of things going on in the world with many variables involved, and it can't just be put through a Christian lens and made sense of, maybe.
Yeah, I think, I have to agree with you. I've actually encountered a lot of people who, first place, I'll say I was raised a Catholic, and Catholics tend to be a little bit more liberal, even though we have this very hierarchical church and structure. A lot of Catholics have this more liberal beliefs. In fact, a lot of Catholics don't even really read the Old Testament, which I didn't. For many years, I actually started reading the Old Testament. I actually finally read the Old Testament in full a few years ago. So it's kind of pathetic, I guess you could say. But a lot of Catholics tend to be like that and tend to be liberal. And I think that's why I had drifted away. And I'll speak to the ones that I think I know what you're talking about, because I've also encountered a lot of young earth creationists and people who are Calvinist. And a lot of them try to almost force their version of the religion on me. And I don't like that because I don't agree with it. And so I take the C.S. Lewis view that I'd like to appeal to all Christian faiths, and I'd like to appeal to young earth and old earth and anyone else in between. But I do see that as a problem, because sometimes those people can be very insistent. And if they're telling you you're going to hell, I don't think that's a really effective approach. So
I think it is an effective approach, though, because I think a lot of these things come about from pressuring people with the big kind of stick of hell. Like fundamentally, I think that's where a lot of this stuff comes from. So while I'm I don't know, say sympathetic towards universalism, I don't really see it in the Gospels. And I think that if you got rid of it, a lot of people would just go, well, I'm not going to do that anymore. So I think it does, as weird as it sounds, I think that those people who I don't think are very nice in the Calvinist circles actually have an internally coherent, and like they've just hardened themselves to the outside world, and in that way they've got a very effective like method of retention. Whenever anyone disagrees with them, it's easy, you can just say it's the devil. Any doubts, it's just the devil, temptation, etc. And that's the way you can think about things. It's very good then, I think, at retaining people, keeping them in, and away from any kind of confusion and disagreement.
Yeah, and I see John V saying carrot and stick. I teach motivation in my classes, and first place, the carrot always works better than the stick. And so heaven is a much better thing to talk about than hell, number one. But number two, and that doesn't even work. If you actually look at what really motivates people, intrinsic motivators, it's things like meaning and purpose and mastery and autonomy.
Right.
But I'll go back to the meaning and purpose. One of the things I listened to with Jordan Peterson this morning is his talk about meaning and how important meaning is in people's lives and making meaning. And that's one way to get past suffering. And I think that can speak to Christianity. And I think Christianity through Jesus pretty well explains the path we're to take as far as bearing our own crosses and leaning on him and being obedient to God. So I think if you look at Christianity through that lens and just focus on Jesus, no matter which faith you're coming from, I think we can all come together on, just as a Christian, if people are Christian and thinking about Christianity, is just looking at, say, John 3:16 and that idea. And I do believe that there are many doors to get to heaven, many Christian doors to get to heaven, but I also believe, just like Jesus said, they all go through him. So it's kind of similar to Calvinist in one way.
I think for me, part of the issue of that message of bearing your own cross is that, yes, it's good because there's suffering in life that we have to tolerate without it kind of overcoming us. But the problem is you can develop this kind of persecution complex then, where you intentionally put up with situations of suffering where you should actually be seeking perhaps a different path other than what you are. And I think that was harmful for me in a few ways, like in terms of dealing with like career and relationship things that I shouldn't have, holding on to those things too long because I was trying to bear as much responsibility as I could. The second point that I'd say is, even if, and I don't think that things like meaning, purpose, or morality are relative, but I think even if they were, they'd still be worth pursuing. I think because we're these subjective agents and we have this experience of what is good and bad, of meaning and purpose, and we can have them with or without God belief, that still makes them worth pursuing, even if ultimately they're insignificant. We can't do otherwise than experience them as significant to us.
Yeah, so and I want to get back to that morality, but I do see a question about my view of hell. I just believe hell is separation from God, and I believe that would be very painful because God infuses us with a lot of love. And so separating from this source of love, I think, would be a very painful experience, which is why I think that hell is described in that manner, as separation. I don't believe that, as far as the lake of fire and that kind of thing, I think a lot of that is metaphorical. So it's just but I want to go back to this moral argument, because actually that's one of my favorites, and you keep touching on that. So I think that that's pretty neat.
Sure.
Do you think that we have an objective set of morals as
Yes.
humans? Do you think that there are some certain guidelines that we're all?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Okay, good. So I think that's good, because it's then the next question comes as what's the source of these objective morals? So if people say, well, what are the objective morals? We have objective moral values and duties to do what's right. And so if you look at this idea of what's right, we seek equity or fairness, we seek justice, we seek just a number of different things, mercy, love, those different kind of characteristics. And humans are geared to seek that. And we're geared to seek the duty of following the golden rule, no matter what your religious faith is. And so studies have shown that globally. So since we have these objective moral values, the question is, what's our source? And if they're transcendent to any cultures or opinions or the subjective whims of somebody, well, then what is the transcendent source that is above and beyond cultures and eras? And I think that very fairly points to God.
I'd say it doesn't necessarily point to God. I think you could plausibly make an argument that it does. Um, the Aren't I separated from God right now? PineCreek says, "Am I experiencing severe pain?" Um, so yeah, I'm what you'd call a non-natural moral realist, which means that I think that the moral good does exist objectively. I don't think that there are successful reductions to natural things, though there could be, and they could be discovered in future. So I can't close off that possibility. I think that the good then is a sort of Platonic form, and I think even Tom Jump's description of it, the in the best of all possible, the best for all worlds in the best of all possible worlds, I think is actually a pretty good attempt at describing what that Platonic form might be in an articulated sense. But I don't think that it necessarily has to be grounded in a deity. I can't see why that would be.
Well, if it has to be grounded in a source that transcends cultures, eras, and people, and so that's the idea is what's the source. Now, what Tom Jump and I think Tom Jump but definitely some other people that I've listened to, what a lot of them have done is they'll try to ground it in consequentialism. So they'll say, yes, we want the greatest good for the greatest number of people. However, grounding a source and a consequence in the same is actually circular reasoning. So you can't ground the source in the consequence. It's like trying to say an input and an outcome variable are the exact same thing. So it doesn't fly that way. So you have to actually then go to even deontology and say, well, why do we have this conscience and these intuitions to do what's right? And I would say that God has hardwired those within us. So
well, I think so. So, for example, deontology and consequentialism would be what we call like applied ethical theories. So applied to how should we act given a certain set of circumstances. But I think metaethically, that Tom is actually a type of Platonist. He refers to this form of the good, when he describes the best for all people in all possible worlds, and I forget the exact phrasing he uses. He's actually referring to a form, almost like a perfect triangle, which doesn't exist in reality, but there's triangle-ness to everything. So then his applied ethics, I think, are, well, we can objectively analyze every action and see whether it shifts us more towards this thing or more far away from it. But I don't he would be a moral realist in that sense, but doesn't require grounding it in God necessarily.
See, I've heard, let me go back to some of the other arguments I've heard on this. So I have heard atheists who say that it's subjective. And one of the ones that I think really articulates his message very well is Friended Adam. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah, I am familiar with him. Yeah.
So he does a pretty good job of explaining his views on objective morality. And so one of the things that he says is he looks at the consequence in a lot of ways, and he looks at people like Jonathan Haidt and looking at these moral foundations, and he just a lot of them try to ground that in what they call psychology or something like that, or they'll try to ground it in these different sorts of views or consequentialism. But I think that what does make sense on our ethical systems is just trying to figure out exactly why we're like this. I think that's just important. Why do we have this sense that we should forgive people? And why do we have these moral intuitions and moral reasoning if we're just lucky beneficiaries of interstellar matter?
Well, this is because I'm a moral realist. I don't think that we're lucky in that sense. I think we actually do see, as rational beings emerge, that they tend to conform to this particular form of the good, which I'd say is there. This is like I was talking to DJ Raj, who's in the chat at the minute the other day, and we were talking about how if you look at winged animals' evolution on Earth, they tend to flying animals, they tend to conform to this particular form of the aerofoil, and that's because there are a particular set of natural principles where an aerofoil is what provides lift, and now the moral good, it might be associated to reason and intellect in that sense, but I think it actually exists in some way. And as we see species evolving cognition, as we look at our evolutionary ancestors, we could, atheists will often say, well, you see, say a dog cowering when it's done something wrong, which shows that it knows it's done something wrong. Or you see chimps trading coins for money, exhibiting altruism. So therefore, objective morality doesn't exist. But I actually think these are arguments in favor of objective morality. They show that there are some principles that seem to be universal, and it doesn't matter which evolutionary pathway you take as you reach certain abilities of processing. The kind of warring it out of nature seems to be overcome by these things that we describe as good with our intellect, because we're not just purely driven by passing on our DNA and gaining resources. We've got this higher level of reasoning seems to override that. And yeah, I agree, it's narrative driven in a lot of ways as well, but it's just that it doesn't necessarily require a god to be that way. It could be some undiscovered natural property. It could be a platonic form of some sort.
And I think you're hitting on something I meant to hit on, and I think I'm glad you did. So you're talking a lot about evolution, and that's going back to what Adam Friended would be also saying. He talks a lot about evolution, and let me just say something. I think if we go back far enough into ancient history, we can see that humans back then were treating each other in worse ways, I think, in general, than humans treat each other today. And I think that we have evolved socially to understand that we are trying to seek this goal. And to me, the standard against which we judge ourselves and which we've been evolving towards, especially over the past 2,000 years, is Jesus Christ. So I see him as the standard, and I see Christianity as having really ushered in some very good things in our societies, and this idea of an objective moral code, and the idea of forgiving and helping the impoverished and helping women and elevating women. I mean, Christianity's really done a great job with that. And I think as our cultures just grow and continue, people are going to try to figure out ways to get closer to that ideal standard that Christianity has.
I mean, I'd agree in some senses Christianity has. Now there are the obvious objections, which would be seeming like moral atrocities in the Bible, and I wouldn't go down that route. But I'd say that it seems to me that a lot of this moral progress can't be exclusively attributed to Christianity. If you watch Tom Holland with his book Dominion about how Christianity has affected the West in that sense, and his discussion with A.C. Grayling, I think A.C. Grayling brings up a number of very good points about how Stoicism, for example, combined with Christianity, it's this progression. Like, yes, Christianity became the vehicle for a lot of it, and there was a lot of bad as well throughout the medieval period, especially with the Catholic Church. But it seems to be more. It doesn't seem to be exclusively Christianity. You've got this pagan philosophy which changed actually what God was. You know, if you read the initial books of the Old Testament, it seems that the authors of them actually are talking about other gods that they just accept as existing, but Yahweh is like the ultimate one. You see this progression of the idea of God throughout, before it becomes this absolute transcendent all omni properties, etc., influenced by Greek philosophy, the way we might think about it today. And I agree that the narrative of Christ with sacrifice, etc., is incredibly powerful, but there's still mixed theology in there in the Gospels about who Christ exactly was and what his message is. I just don't think it's so clear cut as we can say it that way. I don't know.
I think you're bringing up some good arguments and looking back to the Old Testament. But I would say in the Old Testament that, yes, we did mention other gods, but it also says in Joshua 24:15 that you can choose this day which one you're going to worship. Are you going to worship these other gods, or are you going to worship the one God that's the Yahweh, essentially? And so that's how I would look at the Old Testament. And I actually think it paves the way pretty nicely for the New Testament. If you read all the prophecies that are in the Old Testament, like Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, Daniel 9, Daniel 7, there's a number of different prophecies that point us to Jesus, and he fulfilled those in a very timely manner as predicted by Daniel in Daniel 9, for example. So it's kind of neat stuff that's out there. I just point that, but yeah, I agree that there are some interpretations that you've made a good point on different interpretations of Christianity. I just would say that I don't think that should lead you away from God. And I also wanted to point out, you mentioned Tom Holland. Mm-hmm. I have that book on order. I can't wait to get it. Dominion.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, I've not read it yet.
You haven't read it yet? Yeah, I have it on order. I just got 2 of my 5 books that I ordered. And I really want to see that because I've listened to him twice now. One of the times was on Justin Brierley's station. And another time, I forget where else I heard him, but he's actually came to appreciate Christianity based on his research, which I thought was pretty neat.
Yeah, and I think he makes a lot of really good arguments, but I did think it was good that AC Grayling pushed back on some of them, because there's also a significant influence from Greek philosophy, even from Roman culture, from all these other cultures throughout time. It's not like we just have these homogenous, perfect Christian theological views that are untouched from the external world. And even as the Bible's been compiled over time, copied by people, like in a lot of the early fragments, there are people with different theological leanings who might just have, this word it should be that rather than that, as they've copied it. Little things like this, because people are so invested in their theology. And I think that as we look back on it today, to actually really clearly separate all these things out, like what is the influence of Stoicism, of Platonism, of Aristotelianism on our Christian beliefs today?
Oh, I think it has a tremendous influence. I would definitely not try to claim that it's Christianity solely operating in a vacuum. It's definitely not the case. We're operating in a cultural system.
But then it comes to me, if let's say if a lot of these good ideas come from something like Epicureanism, which is almost devoid of any God belief, then how can we say that we necessarily need God for people to lead a good life, when it seems like we can have moral progress from philosophy without there being theism?
I think you touched on a good point, because a lot of people try to strawman Christians, and they'll say, well, are you saying that all atheists can't be moral? And I think that that's not fair to atheists. I've seen some very moralistic atheists leading very good lives. They're good parents. They're doing a good job in a lot of ways. So I think it wouldn't be fair to try to make that claim. But I would like to say one of the differentiators from Christianity, as far as, like you mentioned, Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, is that Plato and Socrates and Aristotle considered people unequal. And one of the things about Christianity that made us distinct is God looked at everybody as equals, and Jesus made that pretty clear. And so that's one way that we're distinguished, because back in those days, in Aristotle and Socrates and Plato's time, a lot of people thought that women were inferior. For example, women are inferior to men. A lot of people thought that a lot of people weren't being cared for in hospitals, and weren't being educated if they were considered poor, or they were considered women or something like that. And the hospitals, for example, in the Roman Empire, were mainly catering towards people who were soldiers, and they weren't catering towards people who were poor. And people were leaving their babies, especially female babies, out on the roads just because they couldn't afford to take care of them. And Christians changed a lot of that. So Christianity, even as pointed out by Tom Holland in these different books that different debates I've heard, it has done a lot of good. And it's not saying that other faiths haven't helped. Like, I would say Stoicism certainly has some good points to it too.
I think it's interesting, that moral progress point, because I'd say we're accepting there that viewing women as equal, for example, is something that's good. Like, that's something we can agree on almost regardless of our religious belief. But it does seem to me, in the modern day, then politically, where these issues crop up, that it's actually Christians arguing against women having the same rights as men from a theological perspective that they're trying to hold on to. Now, different denominations will obviously disagree. Episcopalian Church, for example, more than happy to promote women to bishops, or etc. But then within certain denominations where they're saying, oh no, it's women definitely can't hold this position or that position, and then we see a clash between what seems on the surface to be what our moral intuition tells us: men and women are equal, equal value, equal worth, and how people are actually acting based on what the Bible tells them.
Yeah, you're right. And so I think that's one thing. You could definitely point out Christians through the centuries who've been pretty awful people. There were certainly some Christians who were slave owners too. And there are certainly some Christians who treat women in different ways. But I would also say it's sometimes pointing to the people to try to say that the belief system isn't true. is not always fair. And I think if we look at the exemplar for our belief system, it's Jesus. And we look at how Jesus treated women, and women were the first to discover the empty tomb. And he elevated Mary Magdalene in a really positive way at a time when women's testimony wasn't even considered credible, according to Josephus. So I think if we just look at our example instead of looking some of the people who failed to exemplify what Jesus has taught us quite clearly, I think that's a better approach.
But then theologically, what we seem to be doing there is elevating the red letters almost above the rest of the scripture, when it's all meant to be inspired. It's all meant to be a reliable way of forming true beliefs. And when we have this whole set of theology, which we can attribute to cultural relativism, we can say it was different back then. That's why Paul's writing this to this specific church. But how are we meant to distinguish that? Because God hasn't put like footnotes in that say, no, this bit just applies for the first 100 years and this bit for the next. It just isn't clear in that way. And yeah, sorry, do you want to?
No, I agree. And I know you're talking to 1 Timothy 2:12. A lot of people will, I used to make a joke if I got a quarter every time some atheist said that to me on Twitter and told me to shut up. I think I'd probably be a rich woman right now, because I've been beat over the head with that particular verse. But I think N.T. Wright takes a really good application of that verse. And so I would probably recommend that anyone just go and listen to N.T. Wright's take on 1 Timothy 2:12. But I also would point to the examples in the early church of the women that Paul elevated, like Phoebe and Priscilla and Junia, all early church leaders. And so I think just looking at those examples, I think that's a pretty strong case against saying that no, women can never serve women can never do this kind of stuff. So I think that's important. And actually, I go to a Baptist church where they don't allow women to serve in those leadership roles. And that's something I don't agree with, but other than that, I like the church. So
yeah.
And thank you, Brian Stevens. Thank you. Merry Christmas to you too. And thank you for the congratulations. Appreciate that. Yeah, Brian Stevens is my first chat.
Oh, really? He's interesting. I always see him in the kind of comments and stuff of a lot of these type things. I think he's agnostic as well. So.
Were you on, do you know, what's his name? Shoot, I'm forgetting his name. I was on this guy's, the Antinatalist. Did you ever hear that?
No, I'm not.
No, okay. So sure. I was on John. His name's John. I just remembered. You sound exactly like somebody who was on his channel in our little book debates that we had, and so it's really funny. You've got the exact same accent,
okay,
everything. So that's pretty neat. So let me ask you this. You said before a personal experience, you said you would use something like that, but I'm seeing people like PineCreek in the chat saying, well, if you have this personal experience, what if somebody else has another personal experience? What can we do about that kind of thing? So I'm just wondering what kind of a spiritual experience would be convincing for you, and not even necessarily to Christianity, just what kind of experience would make sense for you?
Well, prior to my conversation with PineCreek, I do have experiences which I'd say are out of the ordinary, strange, and several of those have been on psychedelics. And I'd say a couple of those in church, when you're singing the hymns, the music's going, the stained glass windows, all that kind of thing playing into each other. It's very, very beautiful. But I think it's a valid, because I could have easily come to the set of beliefs that because of this thing, Allah is real. Because of my personal experience listening to this call to prayer, I'm just going to take it on faith that Allah is real. And now I'm involved in the jihad because this is my theological interpretation. I could have become a Mormon. I could have become a Jehovah's Witness. And I think rationally, as I step back and look at these experiences, they're not a reliable way of forming true beliefs. Now, if there was a God who was interacting, and this God is meant to wants me to have a relationship with him, wants me to be clear on the right doctrine, then I feel like in those experiences, perhaps something could be conveyed like, I know you have this doubt, here is the answer. Or perhaps there'd be something continual. It wouldn't be this one-off where or vague notions of beauty and transcendence, for example, like finding a hymn really beautiful isn't exactly an answer as to how I'm meant to conduct myself or whatever. That's just a feeling of reverence. And so I think that yes, personal experience might convince someone, but when it comes to forming articulated beliefs, um, if someone's claiming divine intervention in their thoughts in some sense in articulating these propositions, I just don't think that that's something that we should then accept. We should have our articulated beliefs about how the world is based off of where reason leads us.
Yeah, yeah. So I can understand that if you feel like you're having, you're in a church or you're in a synagogue or you're in a mosque or wherever you are, and you feel like you're having these experiences, and so you wonder, you do question it, and I think that that's fair, and I think that a lot of our culture does shape some of our experiences that we have, and directions that we go. So I would agree with you on that, and so. So I'm looking at the chat here. I want to see if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask. I see some pretty great people in there. So thank you everybody who's listening. So we've got very interesting Nathan here. And Nathan, I had no idea you've got very deep opinions on a lot of this kind of stuff. I haven't followed you very long on Twitter, so I'm not familiar with you. And I don't know if I've seen you in other chats, but it sounds like you go in the same circles I do, listening to some of the same people. So we've both seen Brian Stevens and all these different chats that we're both on. So.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I think as well that I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater as well. That's, I think they could. So I'm genuinely am trying to, but that's where it becomes very difficult to explore these things in an unbiased manner, because my hangovers from what I used to think, whenever reason leads me somewhere else, I start to think, well, this must be some deception from Satan. This must be, and I think this is such an unhealthy way of viewing the world, where I'm kind of thinking, slipping back into this weird, and this is clearly like psychological indoctrination of some sense, but I don't know how I deal with it. So in that sense, I'd say religion can actually be harmful, because I can't imagine. I was only in it for a year or so. I can't imagine for, say, Jehovah's Witnesses, where it's way worse for life, how they can deal with all those things of having experiences, relationships, etc., where they're constantly thinking that this is Satan tempting them or doing this or that. It must be very, very difficult.
Yeah, and I can see your point. And I think bringing up Jehovah's Witnesses, that is an interesting group. I think that reminds me of like the Scientologists and those kind of people. I think there's some groups that are really unhealthy, and they make it really hard for people to leave. And I think that that's disappointing, because I don't think that the faith should force anybody to believe in it. I think it's not right. And even with the Muslim faith, they had a lot of forced conversions right from the get-go. So they were forcing conversions, killing people. It didn't get off to the peaceful start that Christianity did by any stretch.
I do think, though, that there is that psychological compulsion within Christian groups. As soon as, like I was having, well, I'd say even the fact that these one-to-ones started, say, at my church, where someone was like, well, we'll have a one-to-one every week, and it'd be like 2 or 3 hours. And there was as I reflect back upon these, and I didn't really want to do them, there was a lot of kind of coercion and stuff as well involved in them. And I do think it takes place even within Christianity. I can see a super chat question there if you wanted to.
Yeah, I want to ask. Let me first, before I do that, Brian Stevens wanted to know if you wanted to ask how awesome is being agnostic, and then I'll say, what do you think? Thank you, stupid whore energy. Dawkins' argument that religious experiences might be misfirings of evolved mechanisms selected for very different reasons. Are you familiar with that Dawkins argument?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know how much, again, evidence there necessarily is for that. I think in a sense, though, it's almost a self-refuting position, because I wouldn't say, because it wouldn't be we'd be looking at society in the way that religion has evolved as actually a successful strategy. And I think that then the naturalist who views it like that would have to say, well, people are justified in being religious because it's this successful reproductive strategy that they've adopted. So in a way, even though they're saying it's not true in the sense that it corresponds to the way reality is, they'd be saying it's true in the sense that these biological beings who are compelled to have religious beliefs and participate in religion in that way. So I think, I mean, I don't know that it's true, but I think if you hold that position, you then almost undermine yourself from kind of kind of saying, well, you shouldn't be religious. It'd be like saying, you know, telling your dog why it shouldn't hump other dogs or something. It'd just be this biologically ingrained behavior.
Yeah, and I think Richard Dawkins, I actually think he sort of does atheists a disservice in a way, if I had to talk about him, because I think that some of the other atheists are much more sophisticated than he is. Like I would say Bertrand Russell is a much more sophisticated atheist. Nietzsche was a much more sophisticated atheist.
Mm.
Dawkins is kind of, I read his book, God Delusion, and I just thought.
Yeah. And his refutation of the ontological argument is ridiculous. The what's it, the handicap. So it's greater to have a handicap than not. So then he's saying that, so the greatest possible being is the being that creates the universe and doesn't exist. So therefore, the greatest possible being that exists doesn't exist, and it's clearly self-refuting. The conclusion is A and not A, which is, you know, just, and then to actually publish that. I mean, maybe he's just joking, but that he but I think the new wave of atheists you see coming through, like perhaps your cosmic skeptic, rationality rules types. I think even PineCreek Doug are examples of these people who do have more well thought through positions. You know, they're not just they're not ignorant of Christian theology. They're not ignorant of Christian thinking in the same way Dawkins seems to be. They're actually quite reasonable on these things.
Yeah, and I think that reminds me of Dawkins and his who made the designer. I just think that is just such a kooky argument. Like, you know, he's like, well, who made God? Well, that's the idea. He's God.
Yeah.
He's eternal. He's not something
Yeah.
that you know, it's just, and he thought that was just the perfect thing to say in his book. And he was talking about, I mean, he just, I don't, but I do agree with you. I think I would say rationality rules. I've listened to a bunch of his stuff, and I'd say, and Cosmic Skeptic, I heard him in some debates with Frank Turek, and I thought he was pretty good. And PineCreek, I've been on PineCreek's channel before, even though he's blocked me now. So, so yeah, so I think there are some, and I say Brian Stevens is in the chat. I've got him as a moderator because I think he's a pretty fair-minded person.
Yeah, I think so.
Things.
Yeah, and it's difficult because I don't even know how I necessarily feel, you know, when we're like discussing these things, because I don't want to cause I feel like it's a bad thing to cause Christians to doubt in any sense as well. But I also just think that this is where reason seems to have led me for now. I don't think that there are good reasons necessarily for clear-cut Christianity in any sense. And then just kind of articulating this out, I think like, well, what if this causes someone to doubt or whatever? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And I genuinely, that's not what I want. So
yeah, no, I think that's, and I think you've got an open mind, and I think that's the best way to be. I think you're taking in all the information you can. Obviously, you've studied a lot, and you're looking at different positions, and I think that's pretty awesome. So I think you're doing a lot of the right things. But I want to go back to rationality rules, because I made a video. I listened to a lot of his videos. One thing that I feel like a lot of atheists say, and rationality rules said, is they don't think we have free will. And
oh yeah.
And so what's your take on the free will idea?
I hold to libertarian free will, actually. And now for the argument from science, Nathan's led many to hell in this live stream today. Thanks, Doug. Right in the feels. So yeah, there's on edX online, there's like a bunch of free courses. There's a really good one by, is he called Dr. Peter Say? I think he's studies brain chemistry or something like that, and he's got this argument for free will from quantum phenomena, basically. However, I think that there are also good philosophical arguments for libertarian free will, but obviously the atheists are generally arguing from a mechanical universe of cause and effect, and I just don't think that is the case. That I'd argue from that position of this quantum phenomena that we can't predict. We also don't seem to be able to predict inhibition. So even though we could predict like a neural pathway and say, oh, well, that's happening, we don't seem to be able to predict when that pathway is going to be inhibited, which is something that would indicate free will. But then I've not quite figured out whether it's a dichotomy to say either something is random or determined. Is there another option? I've not really figured that one out. But yeah, I don't think we are determined in that sense.
Yeah, and I'll throw a bone out to Braxton Hunter. Are you familiar with Braxton Hunter?
Yeah.
He makes pretty good arguments on libertarian free will, but I agree with you. I think we have free will. I think one of the distinctions that a lot of people talk about that they don't make, and I think they should, is there's an idea of biological determinism and or there's free will. And I actually think that it's more of on a continuum. Like I think that at very low levels, the basic things that you do to walk, talk, eat, those kind of things that are learned behaviors, a lot of times you don't really give much thought to those. And so it might be to some extent biologically determined in some way. But also if we go to higher level thought and critical thinking and reasoning and our decisions, for example, to believe in God or not, I think that takes us to a complete free will. We can decide if we want to believe or if we don't want to believe. And that's pretty much what it is. So I would say that we have free will too. So you and I agree on that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think accepting the consequences of determinism as well, if we were to then legislate based upon that, I think that would be disastrous. There's an interesting bit from in Simon Blackburn's book, Think, where he talks about, if someone walked into his room right now and threw the dog out the window and said to him, oh, sorry, some events in my childhood led to this event, then this event, so I had to do that. It was determined. That he wouldn't be all too pleased, and he'd turn around and thump him in the nose and say, well, I was caused to do that too. And I think like when you actually, this doesn't mean it isn't true, but I think if we were to rationally accept that, it'd be very difficult to live as if that's the case as well. We at least have this experience of free will as if it exists. So maybe the compatibilist position might be more appropriate.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that's what Rationality Rules put something on there. Stupid Whore Energy. Are you familiar with the? Thank you so much, Stupid Whore. No, that's your name. I wish you'd change your name. What do you think of the Libet experiments, which show our brains initiate voluntary movements before we are aware of having decided to move? Are you familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with that, no, but I think is that what Sam Harris talks about most in his free will book, which I've got lined up to read. But what's his name? Kyle Alexander from Nathan's determined to believe in free will. Kyle Alexander he's got a channel called Christian Idealism. He talks about a different set of experiments wherein there are also these inhibitory pathways. And if you're familiar with McCulloch-Pitt diagrams of how neurons work and logic, these inhibitory pathways, we can't predict when they're going to fire. And I think that is where we'd say, well, we can say that's going to happen, but we can't predict when it's going to be inhibited, and therefore we can't predict the outcome. But I'm not so confident in this because I'm not an expert in the area at all.
Yeah, so I'm just and actually Rationality Rules said something about the Libet experiences, and I'd forgotten what that is. Sarah, I'm going to call Sarah from now on, so I like that name better than she calls herself. But I wanted to say with the Libet experiences, Libet himself actually did say that you could veto a decision that might be something that is coming into your mind. You've got this inclination or this intuition to do something, but you actually could veto it. So in that way, it refuted it. And Libet himself said not to interpret it the way that Sam Harris is interpreting it. So that's just something that's out there. I read Sam actually also mentioned that in his book Moral Landscape, which I've read. So
okay,
have you read Moral Landscape?
No, I've not. I'm familiar with some of the stuff in it, but I've not read the content. So
yeah. So it's Moral Landscape is a pretty good book in some ways, but he takes that consequentialist view. He takes the idea of saying that all people are seeking well-being and we should maximize well-being, although he never really defines well-being. So, but it's an interesting read. I think, and now you mentioned Jordan Peterson before. Would you endorse his philosophy towards God if that, because Jordan Peterson is very funny about, when you ask Jordan Peterson if he believes in God, he'll give you a super long explanation and you're really not sure of what he said.
Yeah, I think with him, the problem is his imprecision of terms and things. So if he just came out and straight up said, here's my definition of truth, it's a pragmatist definition of truth, and but because he's not familiar with these terms, he doesn't do it in that way. I think he's really insightful on a load of points. When, for example, his exposition of pieces of art where he talks about what they might psychologically represent. Moses holding the tablet with the inscription of the law and this superseding principle which everyone's kind of bowing down before and stuff, and that is governing society, etc. Now that's like a great exposition of what's going on there from him. But it's yeah, when I'd be someone who holds to a form of like the correspondence theory of truth, and I think that when Peterson talks about how these things are, he's not talking in like a metaphysical sense that a God exists or anything like that. And so that's where and I don't know that I even agree with everything that he says. Like, I think he has a great message, but take up as much responsibility as you can isn't always a great response. And I've kind of shifted my views on like people with depression and stuff, where they really do need help in a lot of circumstances, and it's not just about telling them to kind of like tolerate the burden and pick it up. Like there might be a place and time for that, but it's not just that. And so I think it's a mixed bag with him, where he's some good things, some bad.
Yeah. So I'd say that's fair. And he says he lives as if there is a God, and then he'll talk about metaphysical substrates and all this kind of stuff. And I think that I almost think that he might actually believe in God, but he doesn't want to let that on because he's really interested in maintaining his atheist and agnostic following. Because there are a lot of atheists and agnostics who follow him, and actually I think have been drawing people away from Sam Harris over to his camp. So I think that that's really interesting.
Well, one of a few of his speeches that I found particularly interesting, where I've not even understood what he's exactly saying, is at Wheaton College. They did that debate, William Lane Craig and Jordan Peterson, and was it Goldstein, Rebecca Goldstein, something like that. Is there a meaning to life? And there were a couple of points, one of which was when Peterson concluded his speech by saying, and William Lane Craig had gone with his whole, well, if there's only relative significance, then ultimately nothing matters. The heat death of the universe, it's all kind of pointless. And people were watching Peterson as being like a sympathetic towards the theist, but he seemed to be refuting Craig, because he said something like, when you listen to a symphony, like it's beautiful. So then to say ultimately that doesn't matter, well, that seems like what Satan himself was saying. And the first time I listened to that, like 2 years ago, I thought, yeah, like he's pushing me towards theism. And now I listen to that and I'm kind of like, oh, hang on, he's actually refuting what Craig was saying about ultimate and relative significance there. And there was another point later on in the discussion where I think the Goldstein lady, I hope I'm getting her name right, and Craig were talking about the Euthyphro dilemma, and they used some philosophical terms, and Peterson kind of tried to engage, and he just didn't understand the terminology, but it wasn't that a complex philosophical terminology. But I started to think, maybe he kind of doesn't know everything that he's talking about in that philosophical domain.
Yeah, that's interesting. So and I've read his book. I read his 12 Rules for Life book.
Right.
He makes a lot of sense. He's got some funny arguments with lobsters and stuff like that.
Yeah,
which I think, actually, what's funny in the chat, I have to say there's very funny things in the chat. So somebody asked, Brother John asked if I was trying to undo the work of PineCreek Doug. And then PineCreek Doug said that you're trying to make me doubt. We each have our strategies. Yes, of course, I want to undo the work of PineCreek Doug. It's totally my goal. but it's it's obviously something everyone has to come up with your own decisions on how what you believe in, that kind of thing. So I think it's not any secret goal. It's actually, it's out there in the open now.
I think the master argument of the street epistemologist kind of position is to do with the falsifiability of the belief, because you watch a lot of these people talk about it and they have, well, I read the Bible and I prayed, or I read the Quran and I prayed, something like that. And God revealed to me the truth. But there's never seems to be like a negative assertion of like, how would we falsify this in the negative sense? Like, let's say if this historical point didn't seem to hold up, or if my experience could be explained in terms of psychological or natural phenomena, would I like this marker for what would actually move me against this belief being true seems to not be there in the theist case a lot of the time. And I think that that's the good point that street epistemology makes.
I think you're right. And I think that that's one of the things with people's beliefs is a lot of times they haven't really thought it through. And I think that that's something that even the other guy, Anthony Magnabusco, I listened to one of his things this morning, just briefly, because then I got mad. To turn it off. But he finds these people who in a lot of cases, they really haven't thought through much on their beliefs at all. And so as soon as he starts asking him questions, they're like, well, geez, I don't know. I'm not sure why I believe. And that's actually kind of sad, because we're called, as Christians, for example, we're called to really do our due diligence and to question everything and to make sure that our beliefs are based on something that's not just willy-nilly and I'm believing because it feels good. We're supposed to believe based on investigation of the evidence.
But he's got a couple of videos uploaded today of like Mormons, for example, and I think he makes a good point in there where he's like, well, Christians watching this will say, oh, what you're doing is immoral because these people haven't thought it through, etc. But surely in the case of the Mormons, the Christians actually want them to question their beliefs and come to a different set. So is it just when it's against the Christian, is it just when it's against your in-group, it doesn't have to be Christian, that street epistemology is a bad thing, but it's a good thing in those other cases because you want them to change?
Oh, I see what you're saying. That's interesting. No, actually, that's the video I listened to, his Latter-day Saints video. He was talking to two guys and he had their heads cut off, and I was listening to it while I was riding my bike, and it was just making me so mad. But I actually have, for some reason, I've been to Utah quite a few times and I've met a lot of Mormons, and I think that there's something about their faith that's pretty positive. I mean, a lot of them live very clean lifestyles. They've got some pretty good things going on, although I don't believe this whole Joseph Smith and the golden plates or whatever it was. But would I say that I think it's not, I guess I should say, I think it's not so bad to ask people to question their beliefs. I feel bad for people if they go to question their beliefs, that they fall out of faith, whatever their faith is, if it guides their lives in positive ways. And so I do. And then as far as PineCreek, he's asking if it were true, PineCreek is very funny. If it were true that your personal experiences of Jesus were not from Jesus, would your confidence in Christianity go down? Yes, if they were not from Jesus, my confidence in Christianity would go down. One of the things that brought me to Christianity, just to mention this really quickly, if you haven't read this book, have you read Mere Christianity?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, PineCreek. PineCreek is, I don't know, Brian. See, PineCreek has me blocked on his channel. So,
okay.
And I've been very kind, letting PineCreek make a big statement in my channel, so maybe he'll unblock me at some point.
Yeah, Doug, you're gonna have to unblock her. He's got sometimes like what's it that like little snippets of when he gets people sometimes, or when he asked some questions. I think was it there was a stream for doubters or something, and he was asking questions and he asked a really banal question that was just irrelevant, and someone went, oh, he's trying to do some of that street epistemology stuff. And he made this little like 20-second clip of what the question was and them saying that, and it was just like something completely banal and pointed. He does have some quite funny ones, but yeah, I don't know. He's gonna have you got a block, Doug? I can't see. I don't know in the chat. You'll have to.
He didn't write if he has me on. So I don't know. I'll have to go investigate later. I'll go back and look at next time I see him on his channel. I'll see if I can get in there, because maybe he did unblock me by now. I don't know. But
yeah.
So anyway, I also wanted to. There was some other things that I was just curious about, and I'm not sure who Cypher in the Matrix. I haven't watched the Matrix in so long, but Reed Nice Wonder says SJ's like Cypher in the Matrix. The steak is juicy, even if not real. I don't believe in Christianity because of that. I want to say why. Have you read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity? Did I ask you that?
Yes. Yeah, I have.
Okay, so because that's what happened to me. Is I was sitting on a plane. First, I was praying to God to say, just show me your form. I don't know who you are, what you are. I was reading the Dalai Lama and these different books and stuff like that. And finally, I find myself sitting on a plane next to a pastor, and the pastor convinced me to read Mere Christianity. And then I got to the trilemma, and that particular paragraph was an absolute game changer for me. It's like it opened my eyes, and my doubt, honestly, with that one paragraph, it sounds funny, but my doubt went away. It was
okay. Interesting.
Yeah, and then but the interesting thing is then I went and bought the book, and it's in this, it's actually sitting right on my, dresser here, but I actually went and bought the book, and I bought it for my brother, and I bought it for my parents and for my sister. I got everybody a book with Mere Christianity and Great Divorce and Screw Tape Letters. And the sad thing is nobody else had that same feeling about that paragraph that I had. And my brother's still an agnostic. So I'm going to ask him to watch this channel. Maybe he'll change his mind. I don't know.
Doug's asking why you think that he's got you blocked, or
oh, maybe he doesn't have me blocked. I thought he had me blocked.
Yeah, I think he's not sure why you think that you're blocked. I don't know.
Well, maybe if I'm not blocked, I'll take it back. I'm apologize if I'm not blocked. I thought he had me blocked. And I guess it was because I think I tried to post something once and it wouldn't show up.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I'd say for myself where I'm at, like even before this, I still, I've prayed today and still asked God if he exists, if he'd lead me there or help me to see. And I've still not, and this raises like obviously we can't see everything in the picture, so maybe before I die or something I get some experience, or I don't know, I can never rule that out, but it at least seems to have these big questions for, well, why are these and this was something where I was in, oh, she is blocked, but he wants you to guess why he blocked you. I think it still raises these questions of, well, it says there in the Bible plainly, like what father will give his kid a scorpion if he asks for whatever a good thing, and yet there's this perpetual kind of silence in at least my prayer life. And I think, well, at what point then, I definitely hit that marker where it was like I'd be like, yeah, there's actually probably not this Christian God there that I'm praying to, because none of these things are being answered.
That's interesting. And I guess the only thing I could say to that is I was in your shoes for about 20 years because I felt like I wanted answers and I wasn't getting them. And and I wasn't getting them. It didn't seem like I was getting any sort of signs from the Christian God. And that's why I was gravitating towards these other things. I was reading like James Redfield's Celestine Prophecy and all these different kind of Eastern ideas and Eastern thoughts. And even I used to read a lot of books by Wayne Dyer, and he's what I would call a really liberal Christian who basically thinks any path you take can lead you to God. And so I was thinking just like he was. So yeah, so it's but I think that if I would say that just and it's probably saying you're agnostic is probably pretty fair. And you say, well, at some point maybe I won't be agnostic anymore if God makes himself known to you in some way.
Yeah. And I really don't like, I get why they do it, but I don't like the atheist thing of being agnostic or claiming to be agnostic to get the intellectual humility points, but then claiming to be atheist. I don't like that. I think the definitions are a bit clearer and should be passed out in that way, of agnosticism being a claim to not knowing or uncertainty, and atheism being refutation of the point that a God exists. Because just saying I just lack a belief in God, I feel, is to also say that so the proposition, belief being a propositional state of mind, is to say that there is not such a thing that is God. It's the same thing going on there. So the atheist position is the assertion that there is no God. Even lacking the belief is to say it. Agnosticism is the claim that we don't have knowledge. You might even have a belief, like I have this tenuous belief that there might be a God, but I don't know what it is, and I think it's not warranted. So I say I lack the knowledge. But I don't like that. I don't like that definition game and the way that that's gone.
Yeah. So, and actually that goes back to when you mentioned the definition game in atheism. I think if we go back to classical definitions of atheism, it was that I don't believe in God, or I don't believe there is a God. And then you have a lot of people today saying that they lack the belief, because I think that there's some burden shifting there, where suddenly now the burden's in the theist camp to try to explain why you should believe in God, versus the burden being in the atheist camp saying why they don't believe in God.
But I think to say I lack the belief is, in terms of what that phrase encapsulates, is the same thing as to say it is not the case that God exists. Because if your claim is that I don't have warranted knowledge, then that's a different thing. But there is a belief on the stance. There's a propositional attitude of that person towards the way the world is, which I define as belief.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think you have a lot of very fair views on a lot of these different types of things. I think that's good.
But
So,
I don't know, going to end up in hell anyway, though, burning forever for trying to figure these things out, apparently.
well, let me ask you this: if you I don't know, see, I don't the whole. I don't know about hell. I mean, it's funny because if you read C.S. Lewis, have you ever read his book Great Divorce?
No, but I've heard it's a good one.
Yeah, you'd like it. Wait, here we got this PineCreek stuff's not showing here. If you read his book Great Divorce, one of the things that he has is this weird conceptualization of hell, where this person is in hell, and hell is like this dark place that the sun never rises, sun never sets. It's just sort of it's kind of dark and dreary, and people choose to be there. And then they get visits. They get to visit what heaven would be like. And a bunch of them go on a bus up to visit heaven, and they get there, and they're just outside of heaven. And all of these people from heaven are coming out trying to convince them to come in. And they're all kind of just turning around and walking away and deciding that they like it better in this dark, dreary C.S. Lewis hell.
Yeah. And I heard there's also a theology club in that book as well, which I think is quite funny. In hell, that there's a theology club. Is that yeah?
Yeah, and they're pontificating over what would it be like if Jesus had lived a lot longer.
Right.
They said he died too young. I mean, I'm like, oh my gosh, they're not saying this. I mean, C.S. Lewis has the funniest sense of humor.
Yeah. So Doug says, I blocked you because you have insinuated on multiple occasions that I am misogynist. Do you disagree with this?
Oh, okay. Well, he was joking around once, probably. I guess I should take it as a joking thing. But when I went on his channel, he sent me a direct message and asked me if I should ask my husband if he for his permission to go on his channel. I was like, what? What is that kind of question? But I'll take that as a big joke, and I'm sure Doug was trying to be joking, and so I'll take that away, Doug. I think retract that insinuation.
Yeah, I think he doesn't mean it. I don't think. I mean, I don't know the guy in reality, so I've got no idea what he's like. I know he likes his spreadsheets, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we've been going on about an hour and a half. I think we've had a really interesting chat. Is there anything else we should talk about? First, can we mention to people where they can find you? I don't know if you have websites.
Oh yeah, sure. I've got a YouTube channel, and pretty much all links are there to like Twitter. I've written a few things, but some of those things are pretty bad. So, but I leave them. I leave everything up just for the sake of like humility, because when I revise my position later on and stuff, even with like I've still got my conversion video testimony up on YouTube, because I think it's I don't want to be like putting out this fake image of who I am or whatever, or what I think, and I think it's natural to shift and change positions and think about things. So yeah, I've got if you just Nathan Ormond on YouTube, that's where I'm at.
And I'll link you in the description. I didn't realize you had a YouTube channel. I'll definitely
no problem.
You've got it. So you've got your conversion to Christianity story on YouTube?
Yeah, I still got it up there. Yeah.
Oh, what a shame I didn't somehow get that up. What a shame we didn't watch that together, right? So, no, that sounds great. I'm going to go find that video, and I'll link that in the description so everyone can watch that. And then of course you probably did a deconversion one too, or did you?
I've not, no. I've just really had like discussions like this where I've said my position shifted. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so and then people can find you on YouTube and on Twitter. I know I found you under NATH with an _, Ormond.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I'll also link that in there in case people want to find you in that way. So you have any other thoughts on actually, let me ask you this. What do you think, out of all the arguments that you've heard people say as far as God or Christianity, which argument do you think actually is one of the stronger ones? And then which one do you think is probably one of the worst ones that you've ever heard?
I think for me, actually, the strongest one that I still think over is not Plantinga's, but Anselm's version of the ontological argument, because I think it might fit with his metaphysics given in Monologian and On Truth, where he describes two metaphysical realities existing in the thought and existing in reality. And I think the objection to his ontological argument would be that he equivocates the two, equivocates existence in the understanding with existence in reality. But I just can't clearly articulate my objection, and I'm not sure if he deals with it in Monologian and On Truth, where he talks about those things. So I do think I mean, strong argument, what do we mean by it? Something that's going to convert people, or all reasonable people will agree from it God exists. Perhaps not the case from that, but I mean, that's the problem, is like there are lots of arguments like the Kalam, for example, which are great. Or, you'll see like Ray Comfort going out and saying, do you think something came from nothing or whatever, which are rhetorically off the cuff very good. But in terms of, in terms of like philosophically, what really gets me is I think that one. The weakest argument, maybe something like Pascal's wager. And I think that that's just because it essentially assumes that Christianity is true in order to work. So you have to assume that Christianity is true, and that if you abandon Christianity, then you've potentially got this infinite time in infinite debt in hell. The problem would be, sorry, reading comment there. The problem would be that there's all these other religious beliefs or other versions of hell. It could be the Muslim God, and then it essentially becomes like a choice between an infinite amount of options, and there's a lot of you can't really decide that way. So yeah, those would be my two kind of.
That's interesting. I think I've talked to atheists who've told me they think the teleological argument's very powerful. And you look at the argument from design, and just the idea that all of the different, almost statistically miraculous odds that the earth has overcome to bring about life as we know it. And so
Yeah.
I think that to me is pretty powerful. And Hugh Ross writes a lot on that if you ever wanted to go watch some of his stuff, because apparently we're in 10 habitable zones, and we've looked at another 3,600 planets that are kind of similar to ours, but only one of them is in 2 habitable zones. So it's just, as some of these physicists have said, it looks like someone's been monkeying with our constants to make sure we're in this finely tuned place. And so I think that's pretty powerful. And we didn't talk about that too much today, but
yeah. And I think possibly the intelligibility of the universe could be an interest, but I don't know enough about that one. And I think that there were some really interesting ancient Greek thinkers on that one, and that's where this whole concept of the logos comes from. That's being written into John's gospel, and Jesus is being called the logos, and it comes from this whole. Well, you see it in like Plato's Timaeus. It's like, well, what's knowledge? Well, knowledge is true belief plus logos, or what, like narrative, story. It means all these things, and I want to do more of like an etymological word study on that thing and how it's used through Greek philosophy, to see if there's anything in that as well.
Yeah, and I'll have to go look at some of those, because I haven't read up enough on that. So I'll have to go back and look at some of that. Daniel in the chat is saying a Christian hillbilly has all the best arguments: repent or perish. So I think there's some of these, and then PineCreek, hell could be a real place, and both Christians and atheists are headed there. Ouch. And so someone's yelling Ozymandias, Ramses. I know that guy. He seemed like a pretty nice guy. We got a lot of people making some comments, so that's pretty good. Does anybody have a question? If you have a question right now, ask now or forever hold your peace, because I will give it to Nathan. So
there might be a bit of a delay between the chat and the stream, I think.
I think there is a little bit of a delay. So actually, have you heard of any of the arguments for example, are you familiar with Gary Habermas's minimal facts argument on the resurrection?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that you can apply that to like Mormonism or Islam. I think you can come up with like a minimal facts argument for those other for other faiths, and if that's good enough for you, that's okay. But it just doesn't seem to be good enough for me. And I think again, when you come to some of I'd possibly reject some of the supernatural claims in the minimal facts historically, like did Jesus actually rise from the dead? I don't know that there's good enough evidence to say that that's a fact, that like 500 people saw him or whatever. I don't know that there's good enough evidence to say that that's the case just from the Gospels.
Right. So I know it's only in one place in the Gospels, in 1 Corinthians 15, it indicates that 500 people saw him. But of course, if we just look back at Peter, Paul, and Jesus's brother James, and look at the examples of those three and the way that they preached for Jesus for decades after saying that they saw the risen Jesus, and they were all martyred for it, and that's been documented extra biblically. I think that kind of stuff is pretty powerful to me. I'd say that one of the most arguments in support of Christianity is just looking at the early disciples.
The problem is that we don't know whether they had the chance to let say I'm not a Christian anymore and then be let free, or whether they would have been killed anyway. And then we also have, like so something like, there's a Netflix documentary called Wild Wild Country about all these people who were following Bhagwan, who's Osho, right? And you might see like these meme quotes of Osho saying like this stuff that's meant to be deep. And those people were alive at the time, and yet they were like, like training to kill people, doing all sorts of messed up stuff for something that clearly wasn't true, these teachings of Osho. You can say the same for certain believers of various faiths who have gone to the death. They were, because I know the argument is, you might say, well, the Muslim fundamentalists now, and someone would say, well, yeah, but they weren't a first-hand witness. They weren't in a position to know if it was true or false. But there are people who are first-hand witnesses to things, who do go to the death for their beliefs still in other religions. And I think that it's not a strong enough argument to convince me of the truth of Christianity.
That's interesting, because I think that's a really powerful argument. And if I just look at the bottom line is, you just look at their writings and what they said. And the Apostle Paul, what he said clearly all throughout his writings was that he was basically being jailed, stoned, beaten, all this kind of stuff. And so I would just say that that's a very powerful case in and of itself. And and then he ends up being beheaded by Nero. So that's pretty crazy. So just seeing some messages here. I'm trying to undo them so they can be seen. Well, anyway, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I want to say thank you so much for coming on here, Nathan.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
I guess I'll go ahead and I'll tie this up. I want to say thank you to everyone in the chat who participated and has been having a very lively chat with some pretty funny comments in there. So Nathan did not change my mind, and I did not change Nathan's mind. So, but I think we both had a really interesting conversation. When you can't just think you're going to change people's minds right now, right in this sort of thing. So
yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close it off. Thank you, everybody. So let me go ahead and end the stream.